Thank you to the UCLA Y&A Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and Haaretz for hosting me. It's an honor to take part in this conversation with so many distinguished colleagues. This forum should remind all of us that the United States and Israel are bound together by so much more than official diplomatic relations and national security interests. It is our shared values and our vibrant democratic institutions, like our excellent public universities and an empowered free press, that ultimately unite our two countries. Our bond is built atop a collective desire to continually strengthen our societies, to build brighter futures for our children and our children's children, and to create a more just and humane world. Look, we all know that democracy can be messy at times. Whether it's administering free and fair elections or passing new budgets or advancing a lasting legislative agenda that ensures government delivers for all of its constituencies, the enterprise of democratic self-government is rife with challenges. But we also know democracy is humanity's best hope for achieving a brighter future. Just as the Biden administration has put together the most diverse cabinet in U.S. history, one that represents voices of those who have never had a seat at the table at the highest levels of our government, so too has this Israeli government put together what I believe is the most diverse coalition government in its history. I am not so naive as to suggest these alliances make the work of governing any easier, but I do believe the work that does get done is more lasting and meaningful when it serves the aspirations of as many of its people as possible. So allow me to congratulate the Israeli government on passing your first budget in 3 years. As most of you know, our Democratic majority is knee-deep in negotiations over a historic budget reconciliation bill, and while there's light at the end of the tunnel, the road is full of twists and turns. What matters is that we never forget that progress is always possible. At the same time, we are all too aware that in free and democratic societies, there are those who seem fixated on stalling progress, who insist on being the loudest voice, even if they represent the smallest of opinions. Indeed, here in the United States, there are a tiny handful of voices on both sides of the political spectrum who seek to question the relationship, the U.S.-Israel relationship, who do not appreciate the complex history of the region, nor respect the depth of our bond. Well, I am here to tell you to simply look at the facts. This summer, as a terrorist organization devoted to Israel's destruction indiscriminately fired rockets into civilian centers over the summer, the United States Congress overwhelmingly backed Israel's right to self-defense and the U.S.-Israel security relationship that supports it. And we will continue to do so. So while some try to claim otherwise, the U.S.-Israel relationship remains strong and will continue to be strong, especially if we focus on a few overarching elements. First, we will continue doing exactly what you're doing today, building bridges between our two countries, embracing the values and institutions that make both our nations so rich. Second, the United States will continue to support the U.S.-Israel relationship and our security relationship. No nation on earth can be accepted to simply accept terrorist organizations on its border calling for its destruction while amassing rocket arsenals. And no matter the conflict, I think we can all agree that the protection of civilian lives must be paramount, and that we mourn the loss of innocent life, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, or religions. We will continue supporting the life-saving Iron Dome missile system, which protects civilians regardless of creed or ethnicity. And I am beyond confident that unlike Hamas's barbaric practice of hiding rockets in schools, basements, and in using civilians as human shields, the Israeli military will continue its practices of warning civilian areas of pending operations and going above and beyond to protect civilian lives. We must also build on the regional component of these threats to Israel. As you may know, the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee have passed versions of a bill to celebrate the historic Abraham Accords and look for ways to continue increasing U.S. support for facilitating more Israeli diplomatic relations with other Muslim-majority countries. In the Senate, in fact, this is happening in real time and potentially working its way to the National Defense Authorization Act as a vehicle, so stay tuned. In May, it was deeply distressing to see the sheer volume of rocket fire from Gaza despite the cordon of its land and sea borders. While I have been heartened to see increased security operation between Israel and its neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea, including Egypt, I believe that the United States can and should do more to improve security cooperation and tackle the maritime and land smuggling routes used by Hamas to illicitly stockpile rockets or component parts. There is also legislation moving that would increase sanctions on those who facilitate support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Third, and building on this theme of increasing regional relationships, the United States must continue to coordinate with Israel and other Middle Eastern countries to seriously constrain the threat from Iran. While the United States is set to restart indirect talks with the Iranians later this month in Vienna, I remain skeptical about both the practice and political viability of a return to the JCPOA. I was not, as many of you know, a supporter of the JCPOA in 2015. However, I was also not supportive of the way the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal without a serious diplomatic path forward in concert with our allies to constrain Iran's nuclear program, to say nothing of its support for terrorism. Unfortunately, Iran's current unacceptable escalation of its nuclear program is exactly what I expressed concern about at that time. History has shown us that multilateral support for sanctions and other pressure is critical. At this point, Iran is so far out of compliance with the terms of the JCPOA, and some of the measures under UNSCR 2231 have expired. So I believe we need to look beyond the JCPOA. Senator Lindsey Graham and I have recently been reviving the idea of a regional nuclear fuel bank. While similar efforts may have been tried before, we believe we should be open to any and all kinds of regional diplomatic engagement that could slow Iran's nuclear weaponization efforts and avert a nuclear arms race in an already volatile region. Senator Graham and I continue to work together on this front because we believe that bipartisan support from the United States Congress is critical to the political longevity of any successful multilateral diplomatic effort. Beyond Iran's nuclear program, of course, we must also continue working with Israel and our allies to address Iran's ongoing and growing regional terrorist threats. While we must do so carefully and within the confines of U.S. law, we must find ways to support the people of Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces. Another collapsed state on Israel's border would not only threaten Israel, but the region as a whole. We must continue fighting terrorist elements in Syria and all the ways in which Iran has exploited and fomented the conflict there. Finally, here in the United States, those of us committed to the U.S.-Israel relationship will continue to push back against all those who try to taint it with partisan politics. When rockets are raining down on civilians inside Israel, it is not the time to call for conditioning assistance. Similarly, when young Palestinians express a desire for a brighter future and new leadership, it is not the time to cut critical assistance efforts in full compliance with U.S. laws. We will continue to use our voice and vote at the global stage and at home to push back on misguided and lopsided efforts to delegitimize Israel, from stopping the misguided BDS movement from seeping into completely unrelated conversations, to speaking out against offensive and ludicrous targeting of Israel by a Human Rights Council whose members remain silent on crimes against humanity in countries just over the border. And we will continue to speak out against the recent resurgence of anti-Semitism and violent white nationalism that undermines the enterprise of democracy whenever and wherever it rears its ugly head. We will continue to facilitate efforts in support of a two-state solution which allows Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace, security, and dignity. And last but not least, we must remain a reliable and honest friend to Israel. We must stand by them when they are under attack, and we must speak the truth. We must find the nuance. We are capable of doing so, and we owe it to our own values and the values that form the basis of that friendship. Leadership matters. I hope to see you all in person at some point in the future. Thank you.